Hi everyone, welcome to this episode of Diverse Talk Matters. To talk about different things around diversity, equity, inclusion, talk about things that people may find challenges with, so we hope you find them really useful. Some are around people's different lived experiences, some really challenging conversation, things that sometimes we don't need to talk about. But we really hope you enjoy the range of topics that we are introducing to you or bringing to you, to your homes, to your house, to your workplaces. We hope you enjoy.
Hello and welcome to the next episode of Diverse Matters. Today we're going to be talking about all things inclusive language with two fantastic consultants as part of the Diverse Matters team. I'm looking forward to this conversation. I think this is a conversation that's going to help quite a few people out there. I'm looking forward to it. Well, we'll kick things off with just getting to know a little bit more about you. So, Paula, if I may ask, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Paula Whelan-Cooper, an EDI consultant with Diverse Matters. I've been working in the kind of area of equality, diversity and inclusion for, gosh, over 20 years. I've been a trainer, I've developed policy, I've done a lot of consulting. I've worked both in the public sector and the private sector at middle and senior manager level, and I've delivered training across all sectors. So fairly wide range of experience.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Paula. And Louise, same to you. Can you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, so I'm Luise Usiskin. I am also an equality, diversity and inclusion consultant and trainer. I've been designing and delivering training and kind of interventions and doing consultancy in this field for about 10 years now. Before I did this, I was a police officer in the Metropolitan Police. Please don't judge me. I did leave. I know there's a lot going on surrounding the Met Police and equality, diversity and inclusion at the moment. Again, a bit like Paul, I've worked in lots of different organisations in lots of different sectors. I do quite a lot in the media sector, so television and film. And one of my focuses is on language. So I quite often run anything from an hour to 2 hours to 3 hour courses just on language. I've also helped organisations produce guidance so that everyone is effectively on the same page.
Okay, we are in capable hands with you two with these conversations. Yes, that just made me want to just jump right in. I'm going to set the first question. Brilliant. Thank you so much, both of you. All right, so here we go. To start things off, so can you give examples of when inclusive language considerations have impacted you or what you've seen the impact of inclusive or lack of inclusive language has done for others? So I'll come to you, Louise, first, if I may.
Yes, I often tell a quite slightly funny story when I'm training to introduce the topic of language. Let's start with the fact that I think lots of people won't talk about matters pertaining to diversity and inclusion because they're so worried about getting it wrong. People are so afraid of getting cancelled because they said the wrong thing or something that's out of date that people won't speak about it at all. And of course, if we can't talk about something, we can't fix it. So I always encourage people to talk about it. But then I do also always tell this story, which makes me laugh, about when someone wouldn't say something. So I'll set the scene. I was at a client, a media broadcasting company, and I was with their global head of diversity and inclusion. And I'd just done a training session, which had gone down fabulously. And their head of diversity and inclusion, he said, "That was brilliant, Donna. I'm going to see you on Tuesday at the senior leadership session." And I went, "No, you won't, because I'm not Donna." And he made a face and looked at his colleague and went, "Who's Donna then?" And then his colleague, who worked in diversity and inclusion, was trying to describe Donna, but she wouldn't say the word black. And it got cringe, really cringe, because she was going, "Donna's got big hair. Donna is a bit shorter than Louise. Donna's a little older." And he knew because he was looking at her with big eyes like, "Come on." And I knew because I was looking at her like, "Just say it. Just say it." And she wouldn't say it. After a minute or two, I put her out of her misery and I went, "Donna's the black woman you met." And he went, "Oh, thank you. I was waiting for her to say that." But the fact that someone who worked in diversity and inclusion even, and this is not a small company, it's a global company, was so afraid of that word she wouldn't say it, when it was clearly the most obvious and easiest way to identify that person, it really brought it home to me how much work we've got to do on this topic. Does that help?
I'd imagine there's quite a few people who have found themselves in those kind of situations, right? Let's identify someone here. Let's talk about everything other than the thing that's actually going to be useful. Yeah, out of fear of saying the wrong thing or whatever it may be, but we're stumbling that can't be useful, that can't be helpful in any way. Yeah, and I'm sure we'll dive back into those topics a little bit more. But thank you so much, Luise. Paula, tell me about inclusive language and like its impact has come to the forefront for you.
Yeah, sure. First of all, I'd like to echo what Louise has just said. I think people are very fearful of getting on. So therefore, they're shut down. They won't say anything because of that fear. And I think I've seen lots of it come up in training. I want to go back, quite a way back. I had a personal experience about 25 years ago. I was attending a conference and met somebody at this conference who I'd never met before. Just having a conversation, and he said to me, I mentioned my partner, and he said, "Oh, what does he or she do?" When you think back, we were 25 years ago talking about sexual orientation in the workplace wasn't always a comfortable thing to do. So it certainly made me, I looked at him, and it was the first time anybody had ever said it to me. And the message I got was this guy is very open, very self-aware, open to different types of relationships. And what it did for me was it allowed me to be my authentic self. It allowed me to open up and then share that I was in a relationship with a woman. And that was such a powerful moment. And I know it goes back 25 years, but it sticks with me as though it happened yesterday. And so for me, that really highlights the importance of just making small changes to the language that we use can really have a big impact for people.
That consideration that person had for you had stuck with you all this time. And it just goes to show, just like a little change, like you say, a little change, a little tweak, how different of an experience that could be for folks as well. It's no surprise that you have been positively impacted by that. And you still remember it, especially if it was novel. And it's a shame that it's a big impact because it was rare. It was enough to have a positive impact.
Yeah, and I think that really shows the power of language, that you still remember that from that long ago. But I think that also pulls it back to why people are so scared, because if someone had said it wrong, we might also remember it 25 years ago. So I think that pulls us back to why people are so scared of getting it wrong. But I think it's such a powerful example of how good it is when we get it right. So thank you, Paula. Yeah, that's a great example.
And I think, I absolutely agree, Louise. It is equally, had it been a negative experience, it would have stayed with me. And I think it is sometimes how we respond when people don't quite get it right is hugely important, because if we respond in a very negative way and assume that people are being malicious, then potentially it shuts people down. It makes them become defensive. We all make mistakes. And that's the thing when it comes to language. As long as we're open to learning and relearning, for me, that's
absolutely. So we often talk in training about starting with the assumption of good intent. And I'm not saying there aren't malicious people out there are, and we will encounter them from time to time. But particularly in the workplace, when we're thinking about language, and we're thinking about challenging or correcting someone, we should start with the assumption of good intent, that they didn't intend to get it wrong or upset us or offend us. But nevertheless, they need correcting. It's about how we do that and how we do it gently and appropriately. I always encourage people to think of that feedback as a gift, like you're gifting that person the right term to use. And hopefully the people on the receiving end also see it as a gift. Okay, brilliant. Now I won't make that mistake and unintentionally offend or upset someone again. But it keeps changing as well.
And you're absolutely right. And lack of intent shouldn't override the impact, because there might be no intent. Impact can be huge. So it is about being open to hearing that feedback. I love that. See feedback as a gift.
Yeah, absolutely. So I had a training session a few weeks ago, and there was a younger woman on it, and she was very, very good. Her knowledge on diversity and inclusion was excellent. And we were talking about language, about different words and which we would or wouldn't use in the workplace. And I had a few on the slides as starting points for discussion. We were talking about the word queer, and she was like, "Oh, that's fine to use in the workplace. I use it, or my friends use it. We use it in our diversity and inclusion group." And I was like, wow, because for someone in my generation, that was a term of abuse that was thrown at us in the playground. And for people of my generation and probably older, that's really triggering. And I completely respect people's right to reclaim it. But for me and lots of people I know, it's absolutely inappropriate to use in the workplace. It was so interesting to have this conversation with someone of a different generation.
That's the thing with language as well, how evolving it is and how it changes. And especially when you're thinking about people's experience, whether it be on we're talking about in the workplace example, like a global kind of context, right? Because we all have our, each country, each city, even within countries or regions, whatever it may be, have their own sort of style or their own sort of level of what's acceptable and what's not. And I think that intergenerational acceptance level is one that's really interesting, but also that are put out there that some groups are completely okay with and some groups are really not, right? When one of the things for me in a past employer, the introduction of like politically black, that really a jarring kind of experience to hit originally. And I'm very comfortable with the term people of color. Again, it might be a generational thing. It might be the media that I consume or whatever it may be. Yet when I'm using that term people of color, that other colleagues who had been in the organization a little bit longer, that term was a massive no-no. This constant evolution and this re-evolution of words and terms and reclaiming power and all of these sorts of things, it's very, very interesting. And I guess my question for this to move forward is, whose responsibility is it when for inclusive language? Is it the individual? Is it the organization? What, is it society? Who sets the tone and what part do we all play with that? Luise, I'd love to stick with you with this.
Such a good question. And I think, like a lot of things related to equality, diversity and inclusion, it's got to be a part of everybody's job, but the strategy and accountability has got to be led from above. So everyone's got to feel free to give their feedback, but there's got to be also some kind of guidance and assistance provided by an organisation if we're working for or with them. So I've worked with organisations where we have created language guidance, and with global organisation, that can get quite tricky because, as you said, different terms are acceptable in different places. We're never going to please 100% of the people 100% of the time. I think it's important we recognise that with language. We'll always have a few people saying, actually, I don't like that term. But we can gain broad consensus on what is and isn't okay in our organisation at this time. Of course, that needs regular consultation and updating. But I think a really good starting point for organisations is to begin to have those conversations. Okay, if we were to do a press release or if we were advertising for a role and we recognised that a certain demographic or a certain protected characteristic was underrepresented, what are the terms that we're going to use? So I think it's really important that organisations provide that structure and guidance. I also think it's important that organisations encourage people and help people to give feedback when something with regards to language doesn't feel right, and also help people to receive that feedback, because receiving feedback can be hard. That can be a hard gift to open.
Absolutely.
And maybe we need some help and support there.
Absolutely. I often think that there's a lot of conversation around how to give feedback and the different methodologies for that. And there needs to be a lot more conversation and a lot more discussion about how to receive that, how to be open for it and how to deal with it, right? Because not all feedback is going to be good. And does that mean that it's not worthwhile because it doesn't make you feel good? I'm sure it could be another podcast episode, to be honest. Maybe we'll look into it.
Oh, absolutely. I find feedback quite hard. So I always tell people, be gentle, give it to me nice. Otherwise, it's waking me up at 4:00 in the morning in 10 years' time. But I do want it. I need it. I recognise it's a gift, but I will be quite open with people with that.
And how about you, Paula?
Just continuing on that theme, I always say in training, it can be hard, a challenge for some people to give feedback, but I think it can be even more difficult to receive it. So it is important, I think, as you say, Luise, it's that be gentle and think about what you are hoping to achieve by giving that feedback. Of course, what we want is for people to hear it, to understand where we're coming from and to make those changes. And if that's what we want to achieve, it is about being sensitive, being gentle and understanding. In terms of whose responsibility, totally agree. It has to come from the top in organizations or in leaders need to lead and very much set the tone for the organization. I always say again in training, if only we had a list of all of those things we could say and all of those things we couldn't say, the world might be much easier to navigate. But actually, that's not how life is. We all have different triggers. So going back to your example, Luise, of the use of the word queer, I really struggle with that term. I know other people don't. I think it's an assumption for somebody in an organization to say, we all use it, so it's okay. Actually, it's not always the case. Some people, that may trigger some deep-seated memories, poor experiences. So we all as individuals have to take responsibility, I believe, for what we say and what we do. and acknowledging that there will be times we may get it wrong without intent, but be open to that feedback and try and understand people. So me, I hear a lot on training. Well, what about those people who are offended by everything? People who are oversensitive, the snowflake generation, all of those terminologies, which make me feel quite sad. And I always say to people, rather than use that terminology, why don't you seek to understand that person's journey? Because there may well be, there's a reason what got them to that place in terms of finding things unhelpful or offensive. So it's a tricky one, but we may have an element of freedom of speech, but what we don't have is freedom of consequence. So if we say something, we get it wrong, we have to own it.
Absolutely. I remember vividly working with a senior leadership group in an organization, and we were talking about terms that weren't okay. And I'd been talking about the term Black and encouraging some of these people that they shouldn't be afraid of that word. And then we were talking about the term Southeast Asian. We talked about the term Oriental, and we were like, okay, that's a no now. I got taught that at school, but now like, no, we won't use that to refer to people. And someone said, but you've just said that we should use the term Black, and that's referring to a physical characteristic. So why then are we using the geographical location of the heritage for this? And I was like, because they're people. I wish there was a formula we could use that would help us, but we need to look into the history and the context of each of these terms individually. And, with people, there isn't a formula. I'm really sorry. But just that idea that there would be quite shocked me. We're talking about physical characteristics here. It means we can talk about physical characteristics there.
It comes back to the almost like the blanket terms, or the what's easiest to just group everyone in together, and that, or just, this is the one rule that fits all. But the fact of the matter is, we're talking about individuals, talking about humans. There's going to be that bespoke and there's that unique approach. And for some folks that may feel long-winded, for some folks that may feel overly sensitive or whatever it may be. But when it's considerations of how included someone feels, when it's considerations of how, like, if someone's up at 4 a.m. just like going over it in their head over and over again, like, why the small discomfort for you or the longer term discomfort for the other people, surely that's the consideration that we should be prioritizing here. Like, how does the individual feel? And at the end of the day, it comes down to asking the question, which is you've both said, in terms of the working out like what's appropriate. Because we've both said there's people who are nervous about language and what to use, but it's about being open to say, hey, is this okay? Is this not? And how do we move forward? It's not just about the avoidance, because that makes the issue even bigger. Absolutely. And then it's not about just not listening and or not hearing or not taking on what feedback you've been given, or see, this is the term, and just doing it because it's your right to speak however you want to. There's got to be with it all. This is why I asked about the whose responsibility is, because yes, things can be set by leaders and it can be in policies, but then we know that the everyday conversations within the workplace, that's different. It's the employee, it's the team that make the culture what it is. It may be set by leader. It's the everyday living of it. That's what the culture really is, and it's those points where I'm curious where folks can build that courage, either call out, ask questions, or proudly walk in authentic as they can, or what the environment allows them to. Curious?
Absolutely. And I do think there's a bit of a tea on all of us to do some of the homework, to think about like the history between these terms. So another term I'll often discuss in sessions is the term homosexual. And if I ask heterosexual people, like, is that an okay term? Most people will say, yeah, that's fine. If we pull back and look at the history of it, okay, it used to be a crime in this country, and it also used to be listed in DSM-4 as a mental disorder. So for that reason, many of us in the community don't really like that term. But then when we move on to talking about heterosexual, people are like, again, is that formula? Oh, but you just said homosexual wasn't okay. So does that mean we can't use heterosexual? And I'm like, no, because that's never been a mental disorder or a crime. And if we talk about the straight people, again, people often say of straight, that's fine. And I say, what's the opposite of straight? And most of the time I'll get someone who just goes, Ben. And then they're like, oh, did I just say that? That's not very nice. And as soon as we think about it, we might start to rethink how that feels. But I do think it's important that we do a bit of the homework. There's loads of great websites. There's loads of great advice out there online that will help us to get it. We're never going to get it 100% right. And then if we have the courage to start those conversations with a phrase like, I'm not sure this is the right term, but then we've invited feedback, which is brilliant. We've shown the courage that we're going to talk about whatever the issue is. But, we've also invited people to chip in with their thoughts. So I think it's really important that we can have those conversations, that we're equipped with phrases like, I'm not sure this is the right term, but also that we do our homework.
But it's also not, to be very clear on here as well, I would add that's not a sign to then just say whatever. Oh, no offense, but like those.
Yeah, not no offense,
yeah,
but
set up to really then offend you. So it's being truly open with that phrase, because I agree that's a good opener. So I'm not sure here, let me know, and then be open to that. I completely agree. It's not just I'm about to say whatever I want, but because I've caveated, I can do whatever.
I'm just going to give a great example just based on what you were saying, Luise, about us educating ourselves. Again, I was delivering some training and somebody in the group was giving group feedback and was saying that they needed the organisation to give them more information around various parts of around equality and diversity. And we were talking about language. And I was then pinning it down and saying, okay, so who in the organisation? And they were seeing it as HR's responsibility. So I pressed further along and said, so why is it HR's responsibility? And eventually they recognized actually everybody has a responsibility to educate themselves. Yes, it's important. The organization helps with that to ensure that everybody is a consistent understanding. But we all have to take responsibility, don't we, for learning and unlearning.
Absolutely. I think that unlearning and relearning point is really important. And you've reminded me of what I was going to say, which was that taking that responsibility is really important. And yes, of course we should consult, and of course we should check in with people that what we're saying is right. But I also see a lot in organizations that we place the burden of getting the language right, or giving feedback, or of getting things right on people from minoritized groups who are already under extra pressure because they're from a minoritized group. And we then place extra work and extra psychological pressure, and maybe use terms that are triggering or re-traumatizing, expecting those people to fix it. It's everyone's job to fix it. And the burden can't be placed on groups that are already oppressed or minoritized, because that's definitely not helping. When I used to work at Stonewall, we had a phrase that if gay people could solve homophobia, we'd have done it by now. And I think it's really important that we recognize that it's everyone else's job to fix it.
I 1000% agree. What I'd really like to talk about next is we want this podcast to be useful for folks. We want this to be a resource. Can you both share examples of organizations that you know of, or practices that organizations have taken that really focus on inclusive language, like in a positive way? What goods out? What's the benchmark? Paula, I'd love to come to you first.
Yeah, absolutely. I read a great example. British Airways decided to make a change fairly recently to their onboarding greetings. So very often, we get on a plane, same on a train, you're greeted with a welcome on board, ladies and gentlemen. Clearly, back probably when I was growing up, would have been seen as being respectful. Actually, now in my mind, is not very inclusive. There will be some people who won't recognize themselves in that greeting. British Airways have decided to make, might be considered quite a small change, but I think will have a huge impact. So their onboarding, they've decided will be welcome on board, everybody. It is a very, very small change. And I often have people say to me, oh, it's all just too much. But actually, if we're struggling to make a small change to the way we interact and engage with people, to ensure that there's a big impact for others, then what is it that makes it so difficult for us? Why is it so uncomfortable for us to make that small change? And I think British Airways really stand out for me. And I think some of the train companies are also following that same beating as same, from what I understand.
Fantastic.
That's one that springs to mind.
Thank you, Paula. How about you, Luise? An example or practices that you know of?
Yeah, so I've worked with a couple of global TV and film production companies who have included guidance around the language related to diversity in their style guide. So most organizations of that size will have a style guide when you're writing your press releases, etc., and so forth. And they've done the work. They've done the consultation with staff, with other stakeholders, and they've produced guidance like, here at X organization, these are the terms we're going to use. And they'll revisit it. They'll consult. I encourage them to consult once a year on that. But everyone feels comfortable because those are now the terms. Like I said, that can be tricky, and there will be different nuances in different countries, but it's literally laid out in a document on the intranet for everyone to access. And there's an email address if you want feedback, if you think, okay, actually that maybe that needs revisiting or changing now, there's a contact. I think that kind of guidance is brilliant. It's never going to be perfect, but it will really help people to start having those conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's great to have guidance. I think for me, the key thing is that they are updated regularly, because if there are anything like policies in organizations, I've worked with organizations to try and bring their policies up to date because they haven't been revisited for so long. And I think if we are going to have guidance, absolutely fantastic, but make sure that we regularly, as you say, keep it up to date, take on board feedback from people, because language changes at quite a pace.
Really
So we
does.
can all think of words that we grew up using and that we now would no longer use. So it does change, yeah.
Absolutely. Even terms that I used to recommend in training that are now like, no, we don't say that anymore. We've moved on. I can think of lots of examples. It does change, but we need to keep up to date with it. I'd also say it's really important that leadership or role modeling terms. One that drives me absolutely bananas is guys. Drives me absolutely bananas. And the pushback I always get when I say, okay, let's retire this term is, well, what can we say instead? And there's so many wonderful terms. Mikayla, when we joined this call, you called us team. I think team is fabulous because it makes people think and feel like a team. So many alternatives. If we put our heads together for 5 minutes, think about it. But people are clutching on to come.
So for me, it's about once I've learned something that has negatively impacted someone or a group, I don't want to reoffend, right? There's certain things that I need to unlearn and there's certain things that I can't unlearn. And that was brought to my attention with the term guys. So I was like, well, okay, so let's think of some alternatives. So for me, it's team, it's folks, everyone. Like, there are all of these other things. And what that is a derail. It's a move from the automatic. And guess what? That's okay. For me, when it comes to inclusive language, the moment that it's been brought to your attention that you're offending someone, you need to course correct. Okay. Some folks won't be pressed, concerned, or whatever it may be. But the minute you're actively triggering someone and you know that you're triggering someone, you need to address that, especially in the workplace. And for me, you do what you can. You do what you can to make it a safe enough environment so people feel like it's psychologically safe for them to be able to show up in that way that they can, because now the environment allows for it. You know, there's a lot of talk about authenticity and bringing your authentic self, but I'm all for a good boundary, right? And protecting the boundary with that. And if the environment does not feel as though that I can, guess what? You don't get that side of me. We all have work to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really important point around those boundaries. And it's something I always say in training. Like, actually, I'm not the thought police. You can think what you want, but I will sort out your behavior and language while you're at work. Make sure that's inclusive. Think what you.
Again, we're talking about people's confidence in this space, right? And it's, oh my gosh, if I do anything that deviates, like, I'm absolutely wrong. But if there's resources to support your learning and resources to support you moving forward, utilize them in that way. But I really like what Paula said. It's like, when, yes, there is freedom of speech, but we're not freedom of consequences as well. And I really like that. And I think I'm gonna keep that in mind having conversations and training as well. So thanks for that one, Paula. Thank you.
We won't always get it right. You can't please everybody all of the time. What words I might be comfortable with, somebody else might not be. So it's checking in, having those conversations. And I think there's nothing worse than shutting somebody down when they get it wrong, making them feel bad, I think, because that doesn't help somebody to develop and grow. It is trying to be a bit curious and understand where they're coming from with the language that they're using, and then navigate together a better, more comfortable terminology for everybody, more inclusive language. Because even if, and that was I was thinking about, you were talking about bringing your authentic self to work. And I hear the expression quite a lot, bring your whole self to work. And if I'm honest, I've seen elements of people in the workplace that I don't want to see in the workplace. So that whole self to work can be really open to misinterpretation. I worked with an organization fairly recently who had it on big posters in the lift, bring your whole self to work. We really welcome that. And then when a couple of members of staff were being managed for poor comments and behavior in the workplace, their response was, I'm just being my whole self. I'm just being my authentic self. So I think we have to be very clear about what we mean. For me, it is very much about people able to bring themselves to work, not have to hide fundamental elements of themselves. So I remember years ago pretending not to be gay in the workplace for fear of the action, the response, the negativity that I might receive. So therefore, I wasn't able to be my authentic self in the workplace. I had to hide a fundamental part of who I am.
And I think that
Yeah.
the transparency of language in those instances, but doesn't solve it. And I think that's another thing that organizations and people need to remember, because you say just because it's on policy, just because leaders have said, yes, this is the way, they're still going to take that time to embed it in. And so therefore, it's still going to take that time for especially marginalized communities to be ready for that. So there needs to be patience with all the things. So you can't say, this is this policy and therefore that's it. There's still that embedding time that I think organizations need to consider with that, and what you can do to aid the comfort and the speed of that bed in and sustain it, but be respectful that it's just because you say so doesn't mean that it automatically is, because people have lived in their marginalized bodies all of their life, and that level of protection for themselves will be with them forever.
Yeah. And I think it's really important. It's great to have a policy. It's great to have guidance. But actually what organizations need to focus on is helping to create that culture of inclusion where people genuinely are feeling welcome and feeling that sense of belonging. A small example, I worked at an organization who tended to shout from the rooftops that they employed a lot of staff with disabilities. And indeed they did. But actually, as many as they were employing were leaving because the culture within the organization wasn't inclusive. So it isn't just a case of having lovely, shiny policies and guidance. You want people to be living the behaviors.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's also really critical that we recognize the rights of people from minoritized groups to reclaim terms, but also recognize that just because a term may be used inside that group doesn't mean that if we're outside that group that we can use that term. So I've had that discussion a lot around terms like queer. I often say to people, think of that term as that reclaimed term, as think of that as a stick that was used to beat down that community. And now that community's taken the stick back and they can do what they like with it. They can play it with it. They can toss it around. But if we're outside that community, we're not touching it.
I really
Even,
like that.
when I'm with my Jewish friends, we might call each other Jews. I don't want anyone else outside my community using that term. It's really offensive and triggering, particularly when we think about the history and genocide and the way the Nazis used that term. But within my community, we might use it. I don't want people outside the community.
And there seems to be this entitlement as well with a lot of the community that says, well, you say, so why can't I? There's a myriad of reasons why you can't. And I see this particularly with music as well, and terms that can be used there. How groups may identify each other or whatever it may be within that space. And if it's popular music, it's a very interesting nuance. Be very nuanced with conversation. But for me, it's the entitlement of, just because you did, therefore I can. No.
Yeah,
strong
absolutely.
no from me.
Exactly. So you talked about boundaries, Mikayla, and I think it's so important that we're able to talk about boundaries like that. I also, and you mentioned the music industry, so I've done a fair bit of work in the music industry, and there was one organisation, I think this was an industry trend actually, but there was one organisation in particular where a lot of the Black people in that organisation felt that the word urban was being used for Black. Yeah, and it was so offensive, and the only senior leaders who were Black people in that organisation were in the urban music department. It was so offensive, but no one wanted to say it until we got everyone together in the training space to have those discussions.
It's complex. There might need to be 2 or 3 more episodes just on this topic. But I have the last question here, and we may be here for a few more hours, and that's fine. But when so many people are weaponizing cancel culture, political correctness and wokeness, how do you think that can build people's confidence and courage with inclusive language? We've spoken about how fearful people can be. We've spoken about how feedback is open, but I'd like to hear the practical steps that organizations can take. To combat this, because it's a very, very tricky space for people. And love to hear your thoughts. And Paul, I'd like to come to you first, if I may.
Yeah, absolutely. So certainly, I think all organizations should be committed to providing training for staff around this area. And for me, I think it's about people learning to be respectful in the workplace, learning to be much more inclusive. And a good starting point is training. But I think in my delivery of a whole range of training, what I often see, you get organizations who provide training as a tick box. So we have trained the staff, off we go. I've worked on the other extreme with organizations who train all staff right from the top of the organization, then are looking for tools to purchase to help to continue the conversation and embed the learning. So this isn't a quick fix of, it's a little bit of training and everybody's sorted. It's about ongoing conversations. I've worked too many times in organizations where I've seen in team meetings, a manager would say, we need to discuss on equality, diversity and inclusion. Everybody looks at the floor, the tumbleweed rolls for a little while, and then the manager moves on. But actually, it's an integral part of everything that we do. It's not just an add-on. Definitely training, but then thinking about how do you then embed the learning, setting objectives for people around equality, diversity and inclusion is also a good way forward, so that people are actively thinking about what can they do to create a more inclusive culture, whether it's with their colleagues or with their customers, clients, or whoever they're working alongside.
I was also going to say training. Of course, we're trainers, we would say training. But I do think training is really important. But I want to say specific training on language. General equality, diversity, inclusion training, great. But I think it's really important when we're thinking about the words we're using. One of the things that I find will most help people with that kind of reprogramming that you were talking about, Mikayla, when we have to reprogram how we speak about things, is understanding the why. And I think without a dedicated specific training session on the language, we won't get enough of the why. So thinking about why that term we might have used in the past, why it's shifted, the feelings or the impact of if we're getting that term wrong, learning why we're changing how we're referring to people is really important. So yes, I'm going to say specific language training. And also, within those sessions, we can create that safe space for people to bring their things to the table. Okay, actually, I've heard this in this workplace and I'm uncomfortable with that because, and this is the term I prefer. I think it's also really important that within that, we don't fall into this trap of out-group homogeneity, which is a bit of a long-winded way of saying, thinking that all the people from one group outside of our group are the same. So I've had people say, oh yeah, but my friend from blah, she says that blah's the right term. And it's recognizing that, okay, within minoritized groups, we're all intersectional and we all have differences and different feelings and different previous experiences. So what fits for one might not fit for everyone else, but it's creating that space for people to give feedback, I think. Is important.
And don't be scared
of that.
Part,
I'd say.
Just to add to that, and don't be scared of that because there are the differences, the nuances. Lead with curiosity. Lead with that, tell me more, rather than the shutdown or the avoidance. I don't believe that when folks get terms wrong, every encounter is malicious. Some of that is misinformed. And if there is the space and capacity to learn from that, do that. You don't have to let the fear of the term or the fear of being labeled as one thing be overshadow actually not trying to help out another human. Let's prioritize that in all of this. Just having folks lead with more curiosity about it all.
Absolutely. And yeah, I think the why is so important. If we're talking about people, explaining the difference between the medical and social models of disability, immediately that's quite clear. And people can say, okay, now I understand that. And now I understand why this is the term that we'll use going forward. I did a session recently where the first thing we started with was talking about the difference between race, ethnicity, and nationality and how that relates to racism, because I think often racism is used as almost an umbrella term to cover discrimination based on all of those. But then actually how are we defining racism? If we're having an anti-racist policy, what does it cover? I think it's really important that people understand the why.
I completely agree. And as I knew it would be, this is a great episode. This is really insightful. And I want to thank you both for your time. And yeah, so as we close out, if there's anything that you'd like to share or how folks can get in touch or hear a little bit more about your work or get involved with you, please let folks know. Paula, I'll come to you first.
Yeah, so obviously Diverse Matters have a website with all the information around the training and consultancy that is on offer. So I'd urge people to go and have a look and see what's available and really commit to. I think what Luise said was right. It's not just around the basic ED&I awareness training, like the commitment to looking at specifically at inclusive language and at Diverse Matters.
You can get in touch with me through Diverse Matters, Luise at diversematters.co.uk. But yeah, any training or if you just want a conversation, get in touch with me through Diverse Matters, and my profile is on there as well if you want to see more about what I do and what I have done.
Team, thank you so much. I appreciate your time, and I will see the rest of you at the next episode. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for tuning into the podcast. Please do spread the word about our channel and tune in for our next episode.